Recording in
that once I'm done with the formal part of the presentation, then we'll have time for my favorite part, which is really the conversation, right? So diversity, equity, and inclusion is a really broad topic. The origin of this presentation was that about this time last year, probably in September of last year, my chapter needed to do some programming around DE&I to meet that COE requirement, and they asked me if I would put something together. It's evolved over time, and when I put it together, I really thought about what should this really be. I noticed at the time that the National Association of Insurance Commissioners was directly confronting issues of racial diversity in the insurance industry. So I said, okay, we'll follow suit. But again, there's so many ways you could go with that. I thought about the fact that we spend a third, and sometimes it feels like way more than a third of our time at work. It made sense to focus specifically on racial diversity and how it impacts our interactions in the workplace. I also thought it was really important that the presentation be real and that it serve as a call to action for each of us to confront this issue with honesty, courage, and compassion. Because at the end of the day, if no one steps up to have the conversations that need to be had to affect change, we're going to be spinning our wheels and we're going to stay in the same situation. The other thing I want you to keep in mind is that the topics that I'm going to discuss today are very specifically about racial diversity and racial interaction, but it can apply to almost any kind of diversity. So I'll let you know that there are many amazing credentialed people who are experts in this DE&I space. They have books, they have papers and talks on this subject, some of which I've used as the basis for this presentation. But a little spoiler alert for you is I am not one of those experts. I am, however, a Black woman with over 30 years of work experience. And if I had to guess, I'm not sure how many people are on the call, but I'd say easily dozens of years of combined experience on this call today. And it's our individual experiences that make us each uniquely qualified to contribute to this conversation. So I'm going to start by telling you what this conversation is not. It's not intended to be comfortable because racial tension, the current climate in our country is very uncomfortable. It's my personal opinion that we have an almost pathological desire to be politically correct. And what that's done is created a veneer over our interactions. And that veneer's been cracked wide open, leaving a lot of people looking around in shock because they didn't realize that we had an issue. Many people of color are tired, angry, we're frustrated, and in some instances afraid. We're tired of the need to conform to corporate culture with regard to how we show up at work. This could be as basic as the way we wear our hair to as complicated as the way we respond to conflict in the workplace. Some of us are angry at the seemingly perpetual trauma from images of Black people being treated like they're less than human. If you've been paying attention to the news, I think within the past few weeks, there's been imagery of people, I think it was Haitian immigrants at the Mexican border being whipped by Border Patrol on horseback. And I saw a meme on social media around that time that called out the fact that you see that imagery on the news, but if you consider the fact that you've got a large, relatively large number of Canadian people who have immigrated illegally into this country, you see no such imagery of them being treated that way at the Canadian border. Many Black people are frustrated because we feel like we're the ones that are expected to do all of the emotional heavy lifting to improve racial friction. And some of us, especially those who count Black men amongst our loved ones, we're afraid of the very real possibility that he might not make it home that night. But to be fair, the situation is not one-sided. I would imagine that some white people are also frustrated, afraid, and probably confused. Frustrated because you don't know how to talk to a person of color these days. You're afraid that anything that you say would be perceived as racist. And maybe confused because a lot of people thought that once we elected a Black president, we were instantly transported into a post-racial era. This conversation isn't intended to be a poor Black people, why won't everyone be nice to us? Or even a let's beat up on white people session. The fact that you've taken time out of your busy day to be here today says that you recognize there's an issue and that you're willing to be open minded enough to examine ways that you can be a part of the solution. So, what we're here to do today is to get a fresh perspective and ideally walk away with actionable items that will allow us to have healthier interactions with people who are different from us. It's not intended to be Tracy speaking on behalf of the entire Black community. My perspective is exactly that, my perspective. But it is an invitation for us to interrogate our beliefs, to examine how authentically we show up in the workplace, and examine the extent to which we make room for others to show up as their whole selves, especially people who are different from us. Lastly, it's not intended to be the ultimate conversation since we didn't get to this situation overnight. There isn't any magic wand that can be waved and everything will just magically be okay. This is intended to be the start of a conversation, and that conversation needs to go on for as long as it needs to. And realistically speaking, we should always be looking for ways that we can improve communication with each other and ways that we can be kinder and more compassionate to each other. What this presentation is, however, it is a safe space with no judgment. You might hear things here today that you don't agree with, and that's okay. You might hear things that strike a nerve or that trigger you. The purpose of the session is to really dig deep and to become better equipped to lead the conversations that other people might be afraid to have. So I can't see you, so we're going to be on the honor system here, but I want you to raise your hand if you've ever participated in a DE&I presentation that focused on various types of diversity in one presentation. Okay, oh, that's right. They got that little hand raise icon. I love that. Now I want you to raise your hand if you've ever participated in a presentation that puts out the message that we're more alike than we're different and suggests that we'd all get along so much better if we just focus on what makes us alike instead of how we're different. Both of those ideas are really well intentioned, but my mom, who some of you met in Orlando, always told me when I was growing up that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? Both of those approaches have merit, but either is presenting a real equitable solution. And there's something else that I'd like us to think about, that there's something a little dismissive about lumping all marginalized groups together that is really counter to the spirit of what a DE&I strategy is really all about. So you've probably heard of Jane Elliott, and if you haven't, she's an educator who's famous for her brown eyes blue experiment. It was conducted over 50 years ago, right after the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and it was intended to educate small children about how easily prejudice is learned. This quote of hers, in my opinion, cuts to the core of why we struggle so much with racial diversity. And I'm going to take a moment and read it for you. When you say to a person of color, "When I see you, I don't see you Black. I just see everybody the same." Think about that. You don't have the right to say to a person, "I don't see you as you are. I want to see you as I would be more comfortable seeing you." We're going to talk a little bit about the idea of culture. And for the purpose of this discussion, we're going to define culture as a set of shared beliefs and behaviors that's connected to a group, a community, or an organization. And a thought I'd like to park here for a moment is that in the workplace, culture is dictated by the power dynamic of the organization, and that those who are not in positions of power are expected to conform if they want to be successful within the context of that culture. So let's put a pin in that and we'll come back to it in just a moment. So why do we need to discuss race in the workplace? I started my insurance career in 1984, and back then, relatively speaking, there wasn't as much emphasis on work-life balance, on diversity, or on employee engagement. So if you fast forward to 2021, today, an organization's corporate culture, including how they treat their employees, impacts the way they're perceived in the marketplace, and that impacts their business results. And I think I think that has a lot to do with the internet and how quickly information is disseminated. Many corporate cultures today are much more relaxed. We're allowed to wear business casual attire to work. Some of us have flex time, and even before COVID, many of us were allowed to work from home. The general idea here being that happy employees are loyal and productive employees. And it's not uncommon for organizations to distribute employee satisfaction surveys. There are actually even external organizations that compile data and certify businesses as a great place to work. I've worked at APSO. This is my third year working there. And every year I've gotten some sort of swanky t-shirt or fleece with the little great place to work icon on it. But let's look at a few statistics. Ethnically diverse teams are 36% more likely to be profitable. And that makes sense. Think about the loss of market share a company might face if their products and services didn't resonate with today's more diverse customer base. And if we make that insurance specific, it could be as simple as understanding how ethnicity might influence the way households and businesses make risk management decisions. For most organizations, it's important that their products and services meet the needs of a diverse customer base and that their sales and marketing resonate with the intended audience beyond just putting Black and brown faces on their brochures. So in order to know how best to engage diverse customers, an organization has to have diverse employees. Implicit in that is that diverse thought is needed at the decision-making table. So that statistic makes it a little concerning and confusing that Black, Latin American, and Black, Native American, and Latinx women earn 25% less than white men. And that 61% of workers have witnessed or experienced workplace discrimination. And that was a bit of a shock for me, 61%. So that means that if you've never personally witnessed or experienced workplace discrimination, it is statistically likely that the next two people you encounter at work probably have. So let's step back to the idea of culture. As I mentioned earlier, culture is determined by the power dynamic. Those in the majority determine what's acceptable, and everyone else has no choice but to conform to that organizational norm if they want to be successful. It informs how we show up at work. Culture is essentially a way of interacting that's proprietary to that group, and it implies a degree of conformity with the values of the group. In the workplace, that gets communicated formally as the organization's vision and mission statements that gets translated into its policies and its procedures. It's communicated informally by the way employees interact with each other. The litmus test for that is what kind of behavior is supported by what's said, but sometimes more importantly, by what's not said. So I want to take a moment and consider the following. Does your organization have a formal policy or strategy regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion? If they do you believe that the organization's policies and procedures, both those articulated and unspoken, are consistent with that policy? Think about how many people of color work at your company. Think about how many of them hold leadership positions or in your department or on your team. How many of them are people with whom you interact regularly? Although a corporation is a legal entity, it's made up of people. So I'd like you to take a moment and think about the people that you work with, the people who live in your neighborhood, and the people with whom you choose to socialize. Think about how many of them don't look like you. It's perfectly normal for us to gravitate toward people who are like us, people that look like us, think like us, communicate like us. And that's because the familiar is comfortable, but that comfort is part of the problem. When we isolate ourselves from people who look and think differently than we do, meaning when we're unwilling or unable to process ideas that are counter to our own, our perspective becomes unduly influenced by stereotype and misinformation rather. That's where you run into those situations where, you're on Facebook or you're on LinkedIn and somebody types something that you disagree with, and you're unable to take that step back and see it from that person's perspective. You're unable to understand how, even though this person thinks differently than I do, their life experience is probably different. So I am going to give them the grace to try and put myself in their position and try to understand where they're coming from, right? Since corporations are comprised of people, we can easily see how a lack of diversity in our personal lives can fuel a lack of diversity in the organizations that we lead. Human nature is to surround ourselves with people who make us comfortable, so this influences hiring and promotion decisions. But true leadership is going to be self-aware enough to purposefully invite diversity into the circle of influence. You'll hear me refer to Black Lives Matter, and please understand that I have a full appreciation for how polarizing that phrase can be. But also understand that for the purpose of this discussion, I mean the concept that Black Lives Matter, not the organization called Black Lives Matter. On May 25th, 2020, George Floyd died when Officer Derek Chauvin pressed his knee onto Mr. Floyd's neck for almost 10 minutes. That horrifying video was widely circulated on the internet, and I remember how I felt when I saw it. It was almost like I couldn't allow myself to feel because, yet again, here was a person who looked like me being treated as if their life had no value, like he was less than human. And this was the tipping point that energized the Black Lives Matter movement. It was a movement that had people, and not just people of color, saying that enough is enough. And to be clear, people of color losing their lives as the result of excessive force by the police is not unique to this decade. I live in Rhode Island now, but I'm originally from Newark, New Jersey. That's in the New York City area. And I remember in 2006, there was a case where a gentleman named Sean Bell was killed in Queens, New York, when police fired 50 rounds into his vehicle on the evening he was out at his bachelor party. So you may notice that whenever you hear people talk about Black Lives Matter and talk about this issue, a lot of times it's couched in terms of the community versus the police. And you might be asking yourself, why the focus on police brutality? And I thought about that and I said, could it be because if law enforcement, the people who are supposed to protect and serve our communities, the people who have had special training on how to handle volatile interactions, how to deal with their bias, how to deal with de-escalating situations, if they can't get a handle on their bias, then how are we regular people supposed to do it? So I want you to stop for a moment and I want you to think about how it must feel for a person of color to be continually assaulted with reports and imagery of other people of color being killed during interaction with the police. Often, in what at face value should just be relatively minor incidents, like a traffic stop in the case of Sandra Bland, or walking home from the store in the case of Elijah McClain, or in George Floyd's case, allegedly passing a counterfeit, I think it was a $20 bill. Right, wrong, or indifferent, no matter what it is they allege to have done, right? None of these alleged infractions represented a danger to the community for which someone should have lost their lives. Contrast that with white supremacist Dylan Roof, who murdered 9 Black people in a church in South Carolina in 2015. Not only did he survive his encounter with the police, but he was treated to a meal from Burger King after his arrest. It's difficult to escape the perception that people of color are stripped of their dignity and humanity when interacting with some members of law enforcement. And the reality is that if you don't see a person's humanity, it makes it easier for you to become detached in that interaction and to not treat that person as a human being whose life has value. So last June, following the murder of George Floyd, a lot of people changed their profile pictures on social media to Black squares. And this act was intended to raise awareness about the Black Lives Matter movement and to invite the conversation about race and equity. Think of it as the same way we're all wearing pink ribbons for Breast Cancer Awareness Month. Even people who had issue with the Black Lives Matter movement were at least participating in the conversation, and that was kind of the point. Communities across the world engage in activities intended to raise awareness. There were protests that took place across the country. Some were peaceful, some were not so peaceful. Speaking personally, I am a nonviolent person. I have never had a physical confrontation with anyone in my life. And my little joke I inject here is that if you and I were ever out together and we were in a situation where we needed to defend ourselves physically, I'm not the girl for you because I couldn't bust a grape in a fruit fight. But as much as I am nonviolent, I understand. So another thing that people about me know, people who know me know, is that I love a good analogy, love a good PowerPoint, love to talk, love a good analogy. So I'm going to use one here that I hope illustrates my point. Pretend for a moment that you're in a place where no one around you understands you when you speak. Imagine now that you're faced with a situation that is literally life and death, and you're trying to explain the criticality of this situation. And again, those around you lack either the desire or the ability to understand you. Think about the lengths that you might go to in order to call attention to a situation that jeopardizes your life or that of your loved ones. Well, that's what it feels like to be a person of color trying to explain the urgency of this issue. And again, I'm not condoning violent protest. I'm just saying that I understand the frustration that fans those flames. So what did all those black squares get us? In the wake of this revolution, a lot of companies have stepped up in meaningful ways and they've helped lead the charge. They've donated money to causes that support Black excellence and the creation of opportunities for the disenfranchised. They've taken their own gut checks to make sure that they're walking the walk and not just talking the talk. And many have done that thing that costs them nothing but means so very much. They've simply said, we see you and we care. I believe USAA held forums for their employees to express themselves. The CPCU Society did a great job of highlighting the stories and experiences of our members of color. And as I mentioned earlier, the National Association of Insurance Commissioners set up a committee about race in insurance, and the work that that committee is doing is ongoing. I can't stress enough that this is a very sensitive and volatile issue. It is without question an uncomfortable topic to talk about. But for an organization to publicly and unequivocally state their understanding and support of the sentiment that Black lives do indeed matter makes people of color feel seen and heard. And that's one of the first steps toward healing. It would have been really easy for companies to issue these vague statements and not, I'm very big on calling a thing what it is, right? So it would have been really easy for companies to not say Black Lives Matter, that we believe that Black Lives Matter. They could have issued some vague statement about supporting their employees of color, but not to specifically call out the why at this time. And honestly, that would have been worse than remaining silent. And that leads us to the next topic. Virtue signaling is the equivalent of what sports fans would call being a bandwagon fan. Virtue signaling is when a person or organization publicly takes a position on something, not necessarily because they feel strongly about it or have a meaningful commitment to it, but because they want to be on trend and they want to capitalize on it. It's really just exploitation. And while a byproduct of that exploitation may be that it helps raise awareness, it's still no replacement for substantive DE&I strategy. And this slide always tickles me. We often see the words diversity, equity, and inclusion together. We might even see the word belonging added to the mix, and I feel like I've seen a construct where there's a fifth word thrown into the mix. And although each word is represented separately, a lot of people treat them all as one concept. But it's really important to understand that diversity, equity, and inclusion are not the same thing. Diversity just is. It exists whether we call it out or not. This world is made up of different genders, different ethnicities and sexual orientations, different religious beliefs, and even differences with regard to which hand people write with. So raise your hand if you've ever worked on a project or tried to resolve an issue at work and you've reached out to someone to get their point of view. So I want you to think about why you would do that. It's probably because you agree that the best decisions are made when diverse points of view are considered. Organizations that fail to embrace diversity miss out on the competitive advantage that comes from being able to see and evaluate a situation from all perspectives, from varied perspectives. So while diversity exists organically, equity and inclusion require intentional action in order to benefit from diversity. Equity happens when those in power level the playing field so that everyone has the same opportunity to be successful. Inclusion happens when organizational leadership includes diverse voices in positions of power and when new ideas are welcomed, not silenced. So think of it this way. Diversity ensures that our organization is a reflection of the community or the world in which it operates. Equity ensures that everyone within our organization is treated fairly. In other words, no one's held back because they're different. Inclusion gives agency to the people who make up our organization to be vocal about diversity and equity and to participate in shaping the culture of the organization. So all of this is really about how we treat each other, right? So by now, we're probably aware that the golden rule's been replaced by the platinum rule. And because I am in all things unnecessarily competitive, I had to find a way to kick it up a notch. And I found the platinum plus rule. The idea of treating people the way they would like to be treated has been refined, and it's asking that we treat people the way their best self would want our best self to treat them. This rule is asking that we strive toward an ideal and interact with each other on a higher plane. I've personally always believed that people will rise to the level of your expectations of them. And it's really important that we give people the opportunity to do what's right instead of interacting with them from a place of hurt that automatically expects them to do wrong and colors everything about that interaction. Doing the work to gain deeper and authentic understanding each other really is the key. This is what builds trust and what facilitates open communication. So, not really race related, but to illustrate this point, many years ago, when I lost my mind and left the insurance industry for a few years, I worked for a small trade association in the travel and tourism industry. There were only three employees, the CEO, a woman named Suzanne, and me. And shortly after I started working there, my boss told me that Suzanne could be difficult to work with and that this was part of the reason my predecessor left. He told me that if I had any issues with Suzanne, I should come to him and let him know. And I immediately let him know that that's not how I roll. We're grown people, we're professionals, that if I had an issue with Suzanne, I would go to Suzanne. And if two of us couldn't resolve it together, that we'd come to him, both of us, and allow him to mediate the issue. Because I've always felt like running to the boss to kind of tattle on someone, it feels a little childish to me. And it can actually put the other person on the defensive since they weren't privy to the conversation you had with the boss. I've always felt that the respectful, adult, and professional thing to do is to address any issues directly with the person. Well, the battle royale between Suzanne and me came much sooner than I thought it would. And I honestly don't remember what our conflict was about. I'm a pretty chill, even keel kind of person. I don't dwell on things that are really unimportant in the whole scheme of life. So whatever it was that we were disagreeing about escalated to a point to me that was ridiculous. We ended up working it out, but that interaction with her showed me that this conflict with her had less to do about with whatever the work thing was and more to do with her attempt to have control over something, her attempt to assert her value as part of the team. In the short time that I'd been there, I'd come to understand that Suzanne felt other, in part because she worked from home over 100 miles away from my boss and me, but also in part because she was a very heavy woman. She was morbidly obese in an industry that valued a certain standard of attractiveness and physical fitness. I also remember an incident when I worked there. My boss was really extra and always, had some gimmick or, something that he was doing. And we were having an event and he wanted us to wear some special t-shirt or jersey. And I remember being in the office alone with Suzanne and having her like really virtually have a panic attack because she didn't want to wear this garment. But she never went to my boss and said anything to him. When people feel other, they feel isolated. When they feel isolated, they don't feel seen, heard, or valued. That can lead to a level of disengagement that can lead to dysfunctional interactions in the workplace if the organization's culture is not inclusive. And in this instant, even though there were only three employees, it was not a culture that supported people speaking up when they had issues. If you've ever been in a situation in the workplace where there's someone who's different, meaning like I look at an example of, I am one of very few Black people in my office. If I was a reserved person, not a gregarious or outgoing person, that reserved nature of mine could be perceived as being standoffish or having an attitude or something like that. So the next time you see someone who's maybe a little quiet or maybe not as friendly as you think they should be, don't immediately attach negativity to that and maybe take the opportunity to draw them out a little bit. But back to this topic. The culture of an organization is going to drive how comfortable people feel expressing their concerns when they feel excluded. And it's also going to drive how confident they feel that the organization is going to be responsive to their expression of those concerns. Forming authentic relationships with people, meaning getting to know them as individuals, can help pave the way for fewer misunderstandings and for the prompt resolution of problematic exchanges. So, another little story I'll share involves an exchange I had with a woman named Teresa. She sat in on the original version of this presentation, and she came to me afterwards and apologized for complimenting me on being well spoken. And you'll hear in a moment why that can be a problematic thing to say to a person of color. But in this case, I didn't remember her ever saying that to me. When she reminded me of the instance, I told her that she had just illustrated my point. Because she and I know each other, we've taken the time to form a relationship with each other. I have a pretty good handle on who she is as a person. That connection sets the stage for me to not be predisposed to take offense to anything that she says. But I took her apology in the spirit in which it was given, and I thanked her for giving me material that I could build into this presentation. So, if we're going to truly discuss bridging our racial differences, we really have to discuss the behaviors that represent blockers to progress. We need to discuss microaggressions, code switching, and what real allyship looks like. So, what's a microaggression? In short, microaggression is the manifestation of prejudice, discrimination, and bias, and it comes in three varieties that we'll speak about briefly today: microassaults, microinsults, and microinvalidations. Microassault is your garden variety racism. It's the use of racial slurs. It's refusing to sit next to someone of another race. It's the telling of off-color, racially insensitive jokes, and one could argue that it's remaining silent when other people do that. It's comments like telling people to leave this country, and it's usually intentionally hurtful, and there's usually no doubt about what it is. If you're at all active on social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram, you've probably seen the so-called Karen or Kevin videos of people acting ugly in racially charged confrontations. Micro insults are those comments that are at times perfectly innocent that demean a person's racial identity. And it's the fact that they're often unintentional that makes them so insidious. Some examples of micro insults are not taking the time to learn, or at least try to learn, how to properly pronounce a person of color's name. And I'll use my name as an example. It's Adedeji, Adedeji. It's an African name, and it's pronounced phonetically just as it's spelled. And interestingly enough, I am African American, and I was married to an African man, and that's how I got the name. And I recently found out that I'm not even pronouncing the name correctly, even though I've used it for almost 30 years. But I've experienced someone completely mangle my name, but have no problem pronouncing an Eastern European last name that's not pronounced phonetically or nowhere near phonetically. Not making the effort to at least to try how to learn how to properly pronounce someone's name. That's at best lazy, and it's at worst dismissive and disrespectful. I've actually seen people tell someone, "Oh, I'll just call you," and then they insert some nickname that they made up on the fly. I always make it a point to ask people for the proper pronunciation of their names when I'm unsure. I've had several speaking engagements in the past year, and it's actually made me smile to have some of the hosts reach out to confirm the pronunciation of my name. It's made me feel valued, and it's made me feel respected. Another example of a micro insult is telling a person of color that you don't see color, like we talked about earlier when we talked about the Jane Elliott quote. If you don't see me, well, first of all, it's hard to see me and not see that I'm a Black woman, right? But if you're telling me that you don't see color when you see me, what you're saying is that you don't see that the way I show up, particularly in a professional environment, may need to be different in order to navigate the bias, unconscious or otherwise, of people in that community. And backhanded compliments that seem to suggest surprise about a positive attribute. I was once out with a group of white women, and the conversation turned to politics, and Senator Cory Booker's name came up. And one woman commented, "Oh, he's so articulate." And I cringed a little bit inside, and I thought, "Oh gosh, here we go." And I'm sure it was meant as a compliment. She's a very nice woman, right? And Cory Booker is indeed articulate. But I need to point out that in addition to being a US Senator, Cory Booker is a Stanford educated Rhodes Scholar. So pointing out that he's articulate is like pointing out that water is wet. And I can honestly say that I've never in my life heard a white person describe another white person as articulate or well-spoken in such well-spoken rather in such like gushing, almost incredulous terms. The last type of microaggression we'll talk about is the microinvalidation. Examples of microinvalidation are comments like telling someone that they're being overly sensitive in the face of a micro assault or micro insult. Telling a person that they're being overly sensitive is just I kind of don't have the words for it, right? A person's feelings are their feelings. We don't get to dictate what those feelings should be, and we don't get to force a person to suppress their feelings because it makes us uncomfortable. Another example is citing the fact that you have friends of a certain ethnicity as proof that you're not racist. If you're a white person who has a black person that you consider a friend, that doesn't mean that you don't have bias, unconscious or otherwise. Conflating. For example, a white woman suggesting that the discrimination she suffered is the same as that which a person of color has endured. As I mentioned earlier, lumping all marginalized and disenfranchised people together and treating them all as one is dismissive and contrary to what D&I is really about. And finally, responding to Black Lives Matter by saying all lives matter. And this cartoon is probably the best illustration of why that's problematic. Black Lives Matter is not a statement of exclusion, it's a statement of focus. And simple logic tells us that unless you're saying Black lives don't count in all, then all lives can't possibly matter until Black lives also matter. Another behavior is important to understand is code switching. Code switching is a process of adjusting your speech, your appearance, and your behavior to fit in. There's naturally going to be a degree of adaptation required in the workplace. I can't show up at work in my, footy pajamas or with my sleep bonnet on, right? As a Black woman, though, I love using fashion to represent my African heritage, to represent my own personal sense of style. If you guys were in Orlando, you saw the Ankara print jacket that I wore when I did this presentation. I love that jacket. I love it so much. I almost want to sleep in it and wear it every day. But 20 or 30 years ago, I wouldn't have felt comfortable wearing that to work. And for those of us who are, of a certain age, we may remember that when the uniform for women was that blue suit, the bow blouse, nylons, and shoes with a modest heel. I'm glad that that's not the uniform anymore. It's liberating to feel empowered to show your individual style at work, within reason, of course. But it feels good to be able to show up at work dressed in a way that makes me feel comfortable and by extension, more confident and more productive. On that same note, when you see a person of color wearing a style that you've never seen before, an outfit or hairstyle, it's okay to compliment or ask questions. What's not okay is to turn that person into a sideshow. If you think about it, right, when would it ever really be okay to go up to someone that you don't have a personal relationship with and ask that person if you can touch their hair, right? As intriguing as we might find it when someone's personal style differs from ours, it's really important that we normalize people showing up as their whole selves by being respectful when they do so. It can be argued that being able to flex your communication style, both verbally and non-verbally, in order to be effective in different environments is a talent. But when you have to constantly show up in an inauthentic way in order to achieve success, it can be exhausting, it can be frustrating, and there's even statistics that show that it can cause clinical depression. And it once again promotes behavior that is counter to the diversity that we're saying we want to embrace. And I do think that this is where trust born of open communication comes in. Conflict that exists because of diversity is a function of a lack of understanding. And it goes back to the idea of being comfortable with what's familiar to us and fearing or rejecting what's unfamiliar. I've often shared with people the idea that as a statuesque Black woman, I think I'm like 6'2" or 6'3" in heels, I don't have the luxury of having a visceral response to situations that stress me out or that upset me. A man might be called confident or assertive. A white woman might be called bitchy, and I would be called angry. And that perceived anger would be perceived as a threat. So I've learned to be mindful of the tone and the timing of my communication, careful with my word choice. And after 30 plus years in the workplace, that process is on autopilot. But there are times that I, like many people of color, become exhausted from feeling like we are always the ones that have to accommodate the bad behavior of others because of their unconscious bias. So I recall an incident where we had a lot of conflict on a project at work. My department was taking the lead on a project, and the folks in another area felt that they were not getting their needs met. My boss and I were both new to the organization, and we didn't know the historical context for why there was so much dysfunction around this project. He scheduled a meeting for the two of us to meet with a VP and another manager, and we had it all mapped out. He told me, I'm going to say this, and I'm going to throw it to you, and then you say this. So dynamic of the meeting was that it was three white men and me. And when it was my turn, I only got about a sentence and a half in before that VP cut me off. And he says, no offense, but I don't want to talk to you. I only want to talk to some other person that he wanted to talk to who really wasn't going to be any more helpful than I was going to be. And he went down a rabbit hole about what he was upset about. And every time I tried to interject and do what my boss had asked me to do, he shut me down. So my immediate internal response, it was this conversation that happened probably within a space of 15 seconds inside, was first of all, who the bleep are you talking to? Followed by, are you talking to me like this because I'm Black or because I'm a woman or because I don't have a fancy title? And ending with, well, none of that really matters because you don't get to talk to me that way. Now, in that instance, I could have matched his energy and we could have gone toe to toe, but nobody would have won in that situation. So being the professional and mature person that I am, I waited until after the meeting and I spoke with my boss. I let him know that I felt disrespected. And I told him that Kevin, and I find it ironic that the man's name really is Kevin, doesn't get to speak to me that way. And also that I was surprised that someone at his level in the organization didn't understand that in today's climate, talking to a Black woman that way could be a big problem, right? Like if I was a different type of person, we could have all been seated in front of the EEOC if I had decided that it was racially motivated. But because my boss has taken the time to get to know me as an individual, he's created a safe space that allows me to express myself openly. When I had that conversation with him, he didn't receive it as Tracy's being the angry Black woman. He received it as Tracy is understandably offended by this situation. And I don't know what he said, but I know about a week later, I got a call from Kevin and got what I understood to be the closest thing I was going to get to an apology. Which brings us to our final topic, allyship. My boss's advocacy for me in that situation is exactly what allyship looks like. In the workplace, we're all striving toward the same organizational goals. So strictly defined, allyship is an association for a common purpose. So advocating for people in these difficult situations helps ensure that we all continue marching toward those organizational goals and we're not distracted by unnecessary dysfunction. We've already discussed the role that diversity plays in the success of meeting those goals, and it's felt really good to see white people stepping up to be part of the solution. It's not enough for people of color to advocate for ourselves. Everyone has to advocate for what's right. So some of the things that people can do are read. There's no lack of material available on the concepts that I've discussed here today. Implicit in that is to not expect the people of color in your circle to bear the full burden of educating you. You have to do the work. There's a saying that I like, and it goes, I can explain it to you, but I can't understand it for you. You can examine the diversity in both your personal and professional lives. Look at the diversity on your LinkedIn feed. If everyone on your timeline looks like you and you never see anything that you disagree with, it might be time to branch out. And you can start by connecting with people of color within our CPCU network. So I'm looking for everybody on this call today that's not connected with me on LinkedIn to send me a connection request. And I should mention here, though, that people of color are not monolithic. My experience as a Black woman may be different from the experience of a Black man. My experience as a person of color raised in the Northeast is probably different from the experience of a person of color raised in the South. I cannot emphasize enough that it is about forming an honest and authentic relationship with the individual and making the effort to understand everything that is unique about that person. You can challenge the status quo. If there are no people of color in leadership roles within your organization, you should question the organization's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you can do this regardless your role in the organization. If you're a hiring manager and you don't see diversity in the candidates presented to you, it's a conversation that you can and should have with human resources. If you're not a hiring manager, there might be opportunities to take up the topic with organizational leadership. And one of the best ways to move the needle is to engage with the employee resource group within your organization that's focused on DE&I. And if you don't have one, you can gather some like-minded folks together and you can create a charter to propose one. Finally, you can form a two-way mentoring relationship with a person of color. Whether we want to accept it or not, being white does come with privilege. You can use that privilege to open the door for a person of color. It could mean being a mentor either formally or informally. It could mean making an introduction that would be beneficial to that person. But it's also an opportunity for you to form an authentic bond with someone who's different from you and to challenge any stereotypes and unconscious bias you might be moving through life with. If you're interested to learn more, here's a list of some resources. Some of them I used in crafting this presentation. I highly recommend this TED Talk on code switching. It's really very good. I'm happy to share it with anyone who'd like to have it. I'm going to leave you with the idea that we all have the power to do something to make a difference within our circle of influence. This conversation is underway, and as leaders, we all need to be a part of it. I really thank you for your time and attention, and I don't know how much time we have left. If we do have time left, I certainly would love to hear your comments regarding this presentation. Remind you that this is a safe space. I am a safe space, so you certainly are welcome to reach out to me outside of this conversation, and I would love to have this conversation continue amongst all of us. And now I am looking for the stop sharing button.
Well, thank you, Tracy. As you're looking for that, I'll just open it up to see if there's any questions from anybody. I'm seeing a lot of comments in there, a lot of thank yous, Tracy, and they really enjoyed your presentation. I did as well. As I mentioned earlier, this is the second time I've been able to listen, and I really love your actionable items. I love how you weave in your personal experiences and stories, and that just resonates with me and I'm sure with many others as well. And the Platinum Plus rule is something I'm adopting. I really appreciated getting that as well. So let's see if we've got any questions. Just a lot more thank yous. So as Tracy mentioned, please do reach out to her if you have any follow-ups. She's great to work with, and we'll definitely follow up with you. So with that, thank you, Tracy. Thank you for your time today.
I'm going to jump in.
All right.
I did have a question up higher, and just wondering, can we get a copy of the PowerPoint with the resource links?
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be my pleasure.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah, also the presentation today was recorded, so we'll have that live out on our YouTube channel here in the next few days. So I definitely recommend sharing this with others as a great resource, and you'll have those links or the resources at the end as well. So, all right, please stick with me for just a couple more moments if you could. Again, thank you, Tracy. We really appreciate having you today.
All right, you all have an excellent afternoon, and I'm looking for those connection requests on LinkedIn.
All right, and thank you to Michelle Rushing and her programs committee as well for reaching out to Tracy and making today's presentation possible. So I do appreciate that as well. And then just a couple quick announcements I wanted to share with you. This Saturday, the Good Works Committee is sponsoring another cleanup or trash pickup of our Adopt a Highway. That's that section of Tawanda Barnes between Route 9 and Ireland Grove Road. So go to our chapter website if you're interested in volunteering, and you'll have contact information there. Also, very excited to mention that our I-Day is coming up next month, November 10th. And you are not going to want to miss this event. It will be virtual again this year, but we got a great lineup of speakers for you. Things around usage-based insurance, climate change, and many others. And we've got a very inspiring keynote speaker, Meg Johnson. So you definitely want to block that day off on your calendar. The registration link should be coming out very shortly to your inbox, so take a look at that. And then on December 7th is going to be our final lunch meeting of the year. We have Mark Blakemore who will be presenting to us, and you'll get some more details on that here in the near future. So a lot going on still as we round out 2021 and start looking to 2022. 2022 is going to be another big year. And with that, I'll just say thank you again, everybody, for your time today. Really appreciate you joining us. Have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you soon at our upcoming events. Take care, everybody.